Okay, what is up there YouTube? This is J-Man Time, and today I have a video on one of China's almost forgotten assault rifles slash battle rifles of the Vietnam War era. And this rifle here was China's answer to both the American M14 and the American M2 and M3 select fire carbines, and that weapon is the Chinese Type 63. Also sometimes referred to as the Type 68 or the Type 73, depending on where you live in the world. Now, the Type 63 is a Chinese select fire, fully automatic assault rifle slash battle rifle slash carbine that was developed between 1956 and 1963. It was developed during the same year that the American M14 was officially adopted by the U.S. Armed Forces. Remember, the M14 replaced the old American M1 Garand in the late 1950s. Well, the Chinese wanted their own equivalent to the American M14. At this time, China only had two service rifles, the Type 56 carbine, which was the Chinese copy of the Soviet SKS rifle, or semi-automatic rifle, and the Type 56 assault rifle, which was a copy of the Soviet AKM and AK-47 series of select fire assault rifles. But the Chinese did not have an intermediate battle rifle or assault rifle or squad automatic rifle type weapon in service with the People's Liberation Army. So between 1959 and 1960, in 1963, the Chongqing Institute or Chongqing Military Institute began developing what would become the Type 63. Now, the Type 63 is actually a modified or redesigned variant of the Type 56 carbine, which is just the Soviet SKS that was manufactured in China. It uses a modified version of the gas-operated rotating bolt system seen on the Type 56 carbine slash SKS semi-automatic carbine that was manufactured in China at the time in the mid-1950s. The weapon fires from a 20-round box magazine on the original variants, but some of the early prototypes actually fired from a 15-round box magazine, but this was upgraded to 20 rounds later on. Now, later on again in 1968, after the rifle officially entered full production, the magazine capacity was upgraded to 30 rounds, and it was redesigned again to fire from the same 30-round box magazine as the Chinese Type 56 assault rifle. The weapon is chambered for the standard 7.62 by 39mm M43 Soviet cartridge. It has a rate of fire of 750 rounds per minute, and it is fed by either a 20 to 30 round box magazine. The Type 63 has a maximum effective range of 500 meters, but can hit targets as far away as 900 meters, making it even deadlier than the AK-47 or, in China, the Type 56 assault rifle, and the Type 56 semi-automatic carbine, or the SKS as it was known in the Soviet Union. Over 6 million Type 63 assault carbines were produced between 1963 and 1978. The rifle entered full production in 1968, and production lasted until 1978. The reason this weapon is called China's M14 is because, just like the M14, it was already considered outdated before it ever reached full production. Now, going all the way back to the United States, the M14 faced the same problem. When the M14 entered service in 1959, there were already a dozen other NATO rifles that were more advanced than it, like for example the Belgian FN-FAL. And in the US Armed Forces, you eventually had the adoption of the Armalite M16. The M16 entered full production in 1963 and eventually replaced the M14 by 1964 as the standard issued frontline rifle for all branches of the US military, with the exception of some of these sniper divisions, which still use the M14 at this time. In the Chinese military, you basically had the same problem with the Type 63, which was basically outclassed by the slightly older Type 56 fully automatic assault rifle, which again was a copy of the AKM/AK-47. Again, only 6 million Type 63s were made in the span of just 1 decade. In that same amount of time, the People's Liberation Army had adopted over 20 million AK-47/Type 56 assault rifles. On top of that, the weapon really wasn't selling that well when it came to exporting this weapon to other nations. Now, during its run of 1 decade, 1968 through 1978, the Type 63 was exported to a number of nations that were either allied with China or were co-belligerents of China during the Cold War. For example, Albania, Cambodia, Mali, Burma, also known as Myanmar, North Korea, and of course, Vietnam. The weapon was first used in combat during the Vietnam War, when at least a few thousand Type 63s were given to the North Vietnamese army or military by China, as China was one of the main supplier of arms to North Vietnam and the Viet Cong during the American Vietnam War of 1963 through 1975. It was also used during the Cambodian conflict, also known as the Cambodian Civil War, which was also happening at the same time as the American Vietnam War. And it was also used in Myanmar, also known as Burma, during the Burmese Civil War, or Myanmar civil conflicts that began in the 1970s and 80s, and technically are still happening to this very day. Another strange, or somewhat strange, export was to Afghanistan, where the Type 63 was actually given to the Afghan Mujahideen, or the Islamist factions fighting against the Soviet-backed Afghan government and the Soviet army during the Soviet intervention in the Afghan Civil War, also known as the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan by most Western countries. The Type 63 was also exported to Mali during the Cold War, and is also still used by some of the militias in Mali, along with some of the insurgents fighting against the Malayan military. The Type 63 was also exported to nations like Bangladesh, Guyana, and the nations of Madagascar and Togo, which still use these rifles today as second or third line weapons in their armed forces. So even though only 6 million Type 63s were made, they were at least exported to a number of nations, largely during the Cold War, and even to an extent in the early 1990s. So here's a list of conflicts that the Type 63 appeared in as either a standard issued or secondary rifle being used by one or more factions during these conflicts. You had the Vietnam War, you had the Cambodian Civil War, you had the Sino-Vietnamese War, which was actually a war between Vietnam and China, which began in 1979, just 1 year after the end of the Vietnam War against the Khmer in Cambodia. You also had the Soviet-Afghan War, the El Salvadorian Civil War, where the Type 63 was used by both sides to a limited extent in this conflict. And you also had the Tuareg Rebellion of the early to mid 1990s, which was a major conflict that happened in Mali and Niger. And you also had the Type 63 being used in the Kosovo War, or Kosovo War of 1998 through 2001, in which Albania actually supplied some of its Type 63s to Albanian insurgents in the region of Kosovo in the late 90s and early 2000s. By 1978, the Type 63 had been almost completely replaced by the older Type 56 and the later Type 81 and Type 87 series of assault rifles. Today, in the 21st century, the Type 56 is still used by some elements of the Chinese National Guard, also known as the People's Liberation Self-Defense Forces, which are basically China's equivalent of the National Guard. And they are also used as ceremonial rifles alongside the older Type 56 semi-automatic carbine, also known as the SKS rifle to most of us Westerners. So despite having a service life of really only 10 years as a frontline weapon, it is still used at least as a National Guard type weapon or style weapon by some minor elements of the Chinese armed forces. And it is still used in a variety of other nations that are either allied with China or are supplied with weapons from China. So the Type 56 has gone the way of the M14. The American M14 battle rifle has pretty much suffered the same fate. It is mostly used as a National Guard's weapon, but it is also used as a sniper rifle to the limited extent by some elements of the US Armed Forces. It is also used to a very limited extent by many countries that are allied with the US, for example the Philippines and Korea. So both the Type 63 and the American M14 are two rifles that are very similar, and they both were used during the Vietnam conflict, which was pretty much the biggest conflict they were used in during the Cold War. But in terms of Chinese weapons, the Type 63 goes on as one of China's lesser known assault rifle slash battle rifle slash carbines developed during the Cold War, and was used by a variety of allied nations during many of the major Cold War conflicts, like the Vietnam War, for example, and is still used to a very limited extent to this day. So what do you all think of this? The Chinese Type 63, China's M14. What do you all think of this? Please tell me in the comments section below, and until next time, this was J-Man Time, signing off.